Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everyone. Well, today we can have a look at climate imperialism or carbon imperialism. Well, there's a growing sentiment in the developing parts of our world on the current crop of green policies being similar, very similar to the colonial era. So I want to begin by this quote from Thomas Sowell, which says, "Freedom has cost too much blood and agony to be relinquished at the cheap price of rhetoric." So now, we know that many countries went through a lot of suppression under colonial rule, and it's past, yes, but then they became free in the past century and are all considered as autonomous now. So just to give you an example, my country, India, there were terrible manufactured famines and thousands were killed in the freedom fight before we got our independence in 1947. And there are many other countries like India. So, but now this hard-fought freedom is being threatened by climate policies put forward by climate alarmists. So these climate policies are rooted in rhetoric. They are persuasive and impressive PR about the end of this world due to man-made climate change, and it often lacks sincerity and accuracy in science. And it is also accompanied with no empathy for developmental needs of people in these countries. And the current situation of these people cannot be understood just by reading a report or even by making a short visit there. The state of poverty is really brutal. So how do we define climate imperialism? It's when a group of unelected people in elite global political bodies try to enforce their restrictive energy policies on people in sovereign nations, and you have the definition for climate imperialism. So we all know that there are multiple routes through which the climate alarmists enforce these restrictive policies on people. It began with the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016, and then we have the net zero now. Besides, they have a wide network of environmental activists, non-profits, celebrities. They've infiltrated the academia, and they use the mainstream media effectively. And most importantly, they are cutting off funding to fossil fuel projects in countries in extreme poverty in Africa. It does invoke a lot of response, and here we have the Niger president who says, "Africa is being punished by the decisions of Western countries to end public financing for foreign fossil fuel projects. We are going to continue to fight. We have fossil fuels that should be exploited." It is frankly unbelievable that those who have been exploiting oil and its derivatives for more than a century are now preventing African countries from reaping their resources. So that's the reason why he says that. If you look at the energy disparity across the world, a kettle boiled in UK just twice a day consumes more electricity than a person in Mali uses in an entire year. And for a person living in Tanzania, it takes 8 years to consume as much electricity as an average American uses in 1 month. And forget people, consider electrical appliances. Like a freezer in the United States consumes 10 times more electricity than a Liberian in North Africa does in a whole year. So imagine people who are benefiting from fossil fuel driven wealth asking people living in extreme energy poverty to stop using coal. The reaction and response to this has been much severe in some countries that have a larger population and more power when it comes to global diplomacy. One such country is India. And here's the quote from Indian Prime Minister in 2021. "Attempts are made to shut the path and resources for developing countries through which developed nations reached where they are today. In the past decades, a web of different terminologies were spun for this. The issue of environment is also being attempted to be hijacked for this purpose. We saw an example of this in the recent COP26 summit. Today, no nation exists as a colony to any other nation. But that doesn't mean the colonial mindset has ended." So he's referring to the climate policies that are being enforced upon these nations. But we must know that responses have not just been in the form of statements, but also in form of policies. Something that I call as the bipolar twin strategy, through which leaders in developing countries show up at international conferences pledging emission reduction. But back at home, they speak truth and commit to domestic energy policies that ensures reliable and affordable energy access to people. Now, they are far from perfection, but they are trying their best to accomplish this. And among the countries that are leading in fossil fuel consumption in defiance of this global green policies are China and India. As you all know, China is the biggest fossil fuel consuming country, with more than 50% of global coal consumption happening there. And this year, they are renewing the coal supply contracts for all mines and adding another 70 gigawatts of coal and gas power capacity. But make no mistake, if you focus on India, the highest percentage rise in coal this year is going to come from India and not from China. And they are doing this by increasing the import of coal and removing any policies that inhibit the growth of coal sector. Sticking with India, a little bit more detail on it. If you look at the energy consumption by source, the population is currently around 1.4 billion, and 90% of primary energy to these people come from fossil fuels. And this is why India is keen on increasing the capacity of fossil fuels in the country. Their coal consumption has doubled since 2007. And it is only fair to call India as the growth engine of global coal demand. Some argue that India and China are wasting a lot of time and energy in renewable energy installations, but a closer look shows us that the year-on-year change in primary energy consumption is way different between renewables like wind and solar and fossil fuels, especially coal. So the country is trying its best, despite that it is facing a lot of criticism and even challenge. We do not know for sure that they can come up on the top always. But there are more critical things to be looked at, which shows the kind of energy poverty that exists in these countries. If you see, India is the second largest consumer of coal in the world, but when you look at per capita coal consumption, the scenario is totally different. India has the lowest per capita coal consumption among the top 10 coal consuming countries in the world. And if we look at Australia, it has 7 times more per capita coal consumption. And if you look at the renewable champions of Europe, they have 4 times more coal consumption than India. So imagine sitting on the wealth created by fossil fuels and using them presently and asking countries not to consume the same coal. And I love this quote from the former chief economic advisor to the Indian Prime Minister. India cannot allow the narrative of carbon imperialism to come in the way of realistic, rational planning for the country's energy future. Coal will remain and should remain. The time is ripe for creating a green and clean coal coalition that, rather than the unconscionable calls to phase out India's cheapest source of energy, will serve the cause of India's developmental needs. And this is even more interesting. This is from the Minister of Environment and Climate. And he says, how can anyone expect that developing countries can make promises about phasing out coal and fossil fuel subsidies when developing countries still have to deal with their developmental agendas and poverty eradication? Coming from a minister who's supposed to reduce emissions. And that shows us the current mindset of the leaders there. In a sense, they don't have any other option but to make sure that the economy grows and people get reliable energy access. The argument against this in the West is that isn't our world dying because of higher temperatures? Wouldn't it be right to prioritize scientific propaganda ahead of the very lives of people dying in poverty? Well, my answer is no, especially when this is happening. You have ice records in the Arctic showing no major no unprecedented collapse of the ice sheets. You have UH global mean temperatures showing no alarming increase in temperatures. And you have regions in Japan who have shown no increase in temperatures, mean monthly temperatures for the last 70 years. And there are regular cold weather events, record cold weather events happening all over the world. And the icing on the cake, if you look at the current crop of climate models that are supposed to show us how warm our future will be, they are, more than 90% of them are faulty. So how do you trust them? If you look at my country, India, rainfall records from the last 150 years shows no unprecedented increase in drought or extreme rainfall. It has been happening all along. The other side of this thing, how are humans faring in this climate optimum? If you look at that, we are producing record crop production, so nothing to be worried about. And the major food crops, rice, wheat, and maize, has shown incredible increase in production in major agricultural countries like India, China, and US. And certainly we cannot depend on the solutions they are providing to the developing countries, which are renewable tech, because they're proven to not work even in advanced states like California, Texas, and Germany. So when you ask the developing countries to go back to preparing for an exam under candlelight, which I did, make no mistake, don't confuse this with a romantic candlelight dinner. It's horrible to sit under that. We are not going back to that, and we are not sitting in 104 Fahrenheit with our newspapers trying to cool ourselves. We are not going back to that. So the developing countries must not allow their domestic energy policies be dictated by climate alarmists in the West, especially the UN, the World Economic Forum, and the Biden administration. If these countries give in to the pressure from the West, it will cost them dearly. It is my humble effort to bring some of this in my book, Climate Imperialism, which should be published in next 6 months. It will reveal more in detail how pseudoscience and green cult undermine the hopes of billions of people who are living in energy poverty. Thank you.